Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
True nostalgia is an ephemeral composition of disjointed memories. This is what author Florence King wrote. But how does this sentiment apply today? Well, it seems that the world we once knew is on the verge of becoming little more than nostalgia. The values, the concerns, the things we once thought important are all either dismissed or derided. But as the saying goes, the fish often rots from the head. Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. And on today's show, we talk mask mandates, woke Disney, Putin's no-plan game plan, and we discuss the battle between free speech and compelled speech, and a whole lot more besides. I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Evergreen, Alabama on WNWF 1470 AM and WPNS on 1140 AM. Thank you for being here. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows that will whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Let's get started. Should you or shouldn't you? That's the question regarding face masks on public transport in America. Well, it's been a back and forth, as we've all seen. But to help us delve into the politics of it, what's really behind and what we can be expecting coming up, we're lucky enough to be joined by Liberty Nation's editor-in-chief, Ms. Lisa K. Donner. Welcome back to the show, Lisa.
Thanks, Mark. Good to be here.
So, Lisa, give me the basics. Give me the rundown of what's happened so far.
All right, here's the skinny, Mark. Just when you thought it was over. I mean, you feel like you should be singing a song. You know, it's unfortunately the federal travel mask mandates have become such a political football. And so, you know, they were set to end, and then they were set to end again, and then they were set to end again. You know, it's a constant extension. But this last time, a federal district judge, and that is true, actually, that title, federal district judge in Tampa, said, enough already, you know, done, fini. And she struck down the federal mask mandate for public transportation on Tuesday. And then, in kind of an after hours thing, up comes the DOJ and says, well, you know, if the CDC says we should go ahead and challenge this, let's challenge this. But in between that time, there was a little bit of time for the Associated Press to get a poll out. But I'll stop there and let you.
Sure. There's so many facets to this story. I mean, we had directly after the judge ruled that what they were doing, the CDC's order was basically unlawful. You had Joe Biden made a quick response and says, well, you know, I guess people can wear masks if they want to and not if they don't.
I know.
So is this a case of we have a rogue Joe Biden?
No, you know, he's consistently not knowing what's going on. You know, I think there's nothing new here. You know, they tell him what to say. And, you know, I hate to be so mean, you know, because I do think he suffers from a problem here. But, you know, he has to answer if he's president of the United States. And I just think he's out of touch. But I will say a little bit in his defense, it is hard to keep score, you know, to mask
True.
or not to mask. I mean, tomorrow, for instance, I'm going to get on an airplane. And I'm going to get on an airplane without wearing my mask. But you bet I'm going to have one in my back pocket.
Absolutely. It's the sensible way to do it because you never know when things are going to change. But speaking of Joe Biden not really knowing what his government's doing, isn't that a serious cause for concern for Americans that it's not Joe Biden who's making decisions? Because that's what it seems to outside observers. It seems that it's not Joe Biden making the policy. And if that's true, then who is?
No, you're right. And I think everybody thinks it's his staff because they're always contradicting him. But look, we're more than a year into this. The American people are sort of used to him being out of it. So what we're having to do is just live with it. I mean, we got to live with it. What are the alternatives here? They're not good. And just push on and deal with, you know, the people or the powers that be. I don't know if it's Ron Klain. I don't know who is running things, but they seem to always contradict Joe. But, you know, I just wanted to bring up one thing, and that was the AP poll that said 56%.
That was my next question, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
Hit me with that. Hit me with those numbers.
56% of Americans are okay. In fact, they want mask mandates on federal transportation, well, on public transportation, let's say, not federal transportation. The APNORC, Center for Public Affairs Research, said 56%. And of course, they said it's along party lines. 80% of Democrats said to keep their masks. We're all for it. But 45% of Republicans said, I've had it. I wonder, are they polling people who have never gotten their rear ends on a flight in America or anywhere else? Are they talking to people that actually get on Amtrak and have to sit for 3 hours or longer in, a mask to get from Washington to New York? Are they dealing with people who have to go 5 hours from, say, Washington to LA? I mean, come on. I don't know a single soul, and maybe I'm living in a bubble. Okay, you can accuse me of that. I don't know of a single soul that is really so excited to get masked up to get on a train or a plane.
Well, I think there's two aspects to that, really, Lisa. I mean, when you look into polling like this, they're not differentiating for people who get to travel in their cars to work and back. Now, any federal mandates on businesses, that's done. That's already done. So these people, they don't have to wear masks anyway for going to work. So you've got people who drive to work. So they're not going to really care one way or the other. They don't have a dog in the fight, as it were, in terms of traveling on the planes or traveling on Amtrak or on public buses on a daily basis, that kind of thing. They don't have a dog in the fight in that. And the other aspect that I think is vitally important is that mask wearing has become very much a way of virtue signaling for many people, and supporting the mask also is a way of virtue signaling that I'm a good person because I care about others because I wear a mask. And that's the messaging that's been coming out from the White House since Joe Biden got into office. So when people say, are you for or against the masks? Maybe when they're being asked the question, what they're actually hearing is, are you going to say that you're a good person or a bad person? And so therefore they answer whether they support it or not.
That's really interesting. Let me turn the tables on you and ask you a question. Do you think that there's a certain amount of brainwashing that has gone on? I mean, people actually think they're significant. And again, I'm not getting into whether they are safe or not. We don't need to get banned on all the social media. I'm not going to talk about the research, et cetera. But do you think there's a certain amount of people that actually feel like, I'd rather wear a mask because I don't know what Joe sitting next to me has, is just
you've asked
You've
asked the right question to the right person there, because brainwashing, it's really one of my favorite topics. Now, what we have to consider is brainwashing, is it tying people to chairs with brackets on their eyes,
right.
a la
Right.
Clockwork Orange, or is it constant repetition of a theme, which is very likely what's been happening to America, rightly or wrongly, whether the information is right or wrong. But there's a constant messaging that's been taking place, and people have been punished for not wearing masks. There's been a full-on media campaign against people who haven't worn masks for 2 years now. And so I think, there's certainly some low-level mind control going on in the loosest sense of the word.
Let me ask you this, because I know you know a little bit about music. A lot of really great songs that kind of get stuck in your head. It's hooks. Theme and variation, right? Theme and variation. Isn't that what's going on with things like masks? I mean, they take the theme, masking is good for you. And then they vary it. Well, it's good in this circumstance. It's better in that circumstance. It's not as good as in this circumstance. You can use this mask or you can use that mask. See what I mean by theme and variation?
Yeah, that's a really interesting analogy, because like a symphony, it's one tune all the way through, but it's various movements throughout, and they're all building into the greater thematic quality of the piece of music. So yeah, I think you're probably right there with, they have a certain messaging to start off with, and then there's an extra peak in there. There's a little crescendo just to remind people of the tune that they're listening to. I think that's a really good analogy.
But at the end of it all, if it's a really good tune, or, if it has quite a melody, everybody's singing it, Mark.
Absolutely right. It gets stuck in the head. It's an earworm, as we call it in England, and I'm sure you do in America. Right. Quick fire last question for you, Lisa. How much of this is health and how much of this is politics?
Well, in a nutshell, I remember the famous saying from German novelist Thomas Mann: "Everything is politics." And while there are coaching points to be made, I think Mann got a point.
Absolutely. The man knows. The man knows. Lisa K. Donna, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark.
Coming up later in the show, we talk free speech versus compelled speech in our special Talking Liberty segment. But up next, is a woke Disney a broke Disney? Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The Walt Disney Company is in the news again, but for all the wrong reasons. Has the Magic Kingdom's political attitude costed a future generation of customers? Well, that's what we're going to find out with author and podcaster, Mr. Jeff Charles. Thanks for coming back, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So tell me, has Disney, the corporation, has it done irreparable damage to its reputation?
I don't know if I would go so far as to say it's irreparable. A lot of these things tend to blow over, but it definitely has hurt itself. Now, what I will say is that if they do push the agenda that was revealed by Christopher Rufo, then yeah, they will end up causing irreparable damage. People want their kids to watch Mickey Mouse or Goofy or Donald Duck. They don't want to be indoctrinated. They don't need to be preached at. Parents don't want that. So Disney would be wise to read the room here.
Yeah, I think reading the room here is probably a very key point, because it seems a lot of the support that Disney has for pushing this particular agenda of theirs, it's coming from people who are A, very political, B, quite young, but C, and this is the most important part, probably not that many are parents. What's your take on it?
No, I agree with that. I mean, it's a very small fringe. Even within its workforce, I mean, it was a small number of employees who were really pushing Disney to come out against the parental rights and education bill. The majority of employees weren't really pushing for that. And I'm sure a lot of them were members of the LGBTQ community and actually they were right. This was actually shown later that a lot of employees were pushing back on Disney doing this. And some of those were members of the LGBTQ community as well. So I don't think that this represents most people, regardless of sexual orientation, that they're pushing a fringe point of view, and they're basically kowtowing to a small but very loud minority here. But it could also be possible that some of their leadership are true believers in this as well, so they also want to push it. But I don't think that that's likely. I think that they're just making a bad decision here.
Now, the question for you, do you think they'll carry on making these, as you say, these bad decisions, or do you think that they will eventually feel the squeeze? Because I've noticed that people are stopping their subscriptions to Disney streaming channels, things like that. People are avoiding buying the products, the merchandise that goes along with seemingly every Disney production that comes out. There's associated merchandising, which I'm assuming is a large part of the revenue they get. And of course, the theme parks themselves. Mm-hmm. So people are basically voting with their wallets on this. How long do you think Disney will keep pushing along this particular path when their profits are suffering?
It's hard to tell. I've been thinking about this a lot, Mark. It's hard for me to get on my crystal ball on this, because it's really going to depend on how much it hurts them in their pocketbooks. I mean, the thing about Disney, because on the other side of that, Disney owns about everything that people love. I mean, are people going to stop going to see Star Wars? Are people going to not watch The Mandalorian when it comes out, or Kenobi when it comes out on Disney Plus? I don't know. I don't know if they're gonna feel the pain enough. I mean, maybe at their theme parks they might, but when it comes to other properties they own, they might still be able to make enough money while still pushing this. But they also might think long term, maybe this will cause us to suffer if we keep pushing this. So maybe at this point they'll keep it the way it is and not push it further like they were planning. But I think there's always going to be some element of it, because I do think that some of the people that work for Disney are believers and do want to push this ideology.
Now, Disney, it's an international company, of course. It's got theme parks all over the world. It sends its productions all over the world. And I think one thing that was quite notable that not many people are talking about is that a recent movie that Disney released, they issued another version of it in China because the Chinese censors didn't want, I believe it was reference to homosexuality within the production. And they were happy enough to issue that to China. So is it a case that their values as a company only run to the border and not beyond?
Yeah, well, see, that's where I think it would hit their pocketbook enough. I mean, because with China, they make a lot of money from China, so they're willing to bend for China. I'm not sure if the American consumer is going to hurt their pocketbooks as much as China does, but yeah, you see where their principles lie, right? I mean, it's really in profit. So I think they're trying to find the balance between pushing an agenda, but also still being able to make money. And yeah, there's a lot of hypocrisy involved in that, and it's brazen, and there's not a whole lot of people who are calling it out.
And why do you think the people who support what Disney's doing don't seem to be talking about the fact that they're willing to sacrifice the principles overseas?
Because they don't have principles either. I mean, that's the bottom line. I mean, because the thing, that is an excellent question. So for Disney, you can kind of understand because money is involved, but for the activist crowd, for the politicians, for the media people, for the chattering class who are pushing Disney to go against this supposed "don't say gay" bill in quotations, they don't care that they can't say gay in China. They're not going to speak out on it at all because they don't. A lot of these people don't really believe what they say they believe.
Well, clearly these activists and advocates are all nationalists, of course.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So one final question for you, Jeff, or one final topic that I'd like to delve into. It's Governor Ron DeSantis. He's seeking to cut special exemptions for Disney in Florida. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I'm concerned. I mean, because here's my thing with DeSantis. I think he's doing the right thing, but not necessarily for the right reasons. I'm a little concerned when I see somebody wanting to use the state to punish a corporation for expressing a viewpoint that they don't agree with. Now, I do think that he should be doing this because Disney shouldn't be having all these exemptions, and he should also be looking at other corporations in Florida for the same type of thing. And now, if he was using this as a springboard to doing that, then I'll celebrate it. But if he's just punishing Disney using the power of the state, I'm a little bit concerned about that. Like, I don't, that could take us down a road that we really don't want to go down.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of opposition to DeSantis's moves here by the same people that support Disney, but these tend to be by and large the same people who don't support any special exemptions for multi-billion-dollar companies. So again, it comes back to they have principles for one thing, but as Groucho Marx says, these are my principles. If you don't like them, I have others.
I think that sums up the state of American political discourse in 2022.
And on that note, Jeff Charles, thank you ever so much.
Thank you for having me.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. Remember, you can tune in for Liberty Nation Radio on KSRM 920 AM and 92.5 FM out of Kenai, Alaska. Later on, we talk Liberty with Scott Cosenza. But up next, after this short break, we ask if everyone missed Vladimir Putin's real plans for Ukraine. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The dominant narrative goes that Russian President Vladimir Putin was shocked to find such Ukrainian resistance, and as such has had to curtail his invasion plans. But is the world and the government underestimating Putin? And is he following his original game plan, unbeknownst to the West? Well, to dive into what's really happening and to try to answer these questions properly, we're joined by former Principal Undersecretary of Defense Controller and expert in all things defense, Mr. Dave Patterson. Thanks for coming back, Dave.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be with you.
So, Dave, initially we were told that Putin could take Ukraine in 48 hours. I remember those headlines. That was the estimation. And yet here we are almost 2 months down the line, and it seems that he's refocusing his efforts on the Donbass region. Now, I can't help but think that not only was the Western assessment wrong on multiple levels, but that we still don't really know entirely what Putin's plans are. What do you make of it?
Well, I think it's always hard to determine what the motivation for the Russians are. But I think that what you were looking at...
Vodka and American blue jeans.
Yeah, well, that too. But yeah, maybe we could use that, as leverage. Stop the flow of Levi's. Stop the Russian invasion. But you look at what Putin and his forces did, and it was based basically on the fact that they had a misperception of how easy this was going to be. They totally misconstrued the level of resistance, obviously, and they didn't understand it very much about low intensity warfare and people fighting in their neighborhoods, which they know very well. But I think when you step back, you have to say that, this was kind of a no plan. They just thought they were going to move into the Ukraine. In fact, more than a plan, I think it was what you were looking at is simply a Russian behavior.
Right. You see, the way I'm analyzing this, and I might be completely wrong here, but for those of us who have played the board game Risk, I think we're all sitting here thinking that Putin's initial jabs at Kiev were really just a distraction to give him time to shore up the Donbass region. And now that's not a new strategy by a long shot. We've seen military leaders do this for quite literally thousands of years. How is my analysis here?
Well, your analysis may be very correct, but it was pretty costly for the Russians. I mean, they've lost now roughly 25% of the force that they came into Ukraine with. Estimates are as high as 20,000 soldiers killed in roughly 57 days. The Russians lost only 15,000 between 1979 and 1989 in Afghanistan. So this has been a pretty costly effort if it was just a diversion. I'm quite confident that what Putin thought was going to happen was he was going to come in, he was going to surround Kiev, he was going to bring them to their knees, and they would, sue for peace. That has never really been a very good strategy.
What would that suing for peace tactic have looked like? Would it be that they declare independence for, or allow independence for Donetsk and Luhansk, and then a further guarantee that Ukraine won't join either NATO or the European Union?
Yeah, I think that was essentially what Putin thought was going to happen, and then little by little he would encroach in through the rest of the Ukraine, and similar responses he'd get those. I mean, and it's again. It's not so much a plan as a behavior. And you see that they've been extremely brutal in Bucha and other towns that have unfortunately fallen or come under the Russian influence. And I think you can anticipate that as a behavior throughout this conflict.
Let's talk a little about how Russia's actually getting on here then. So obviously militarily, from what we can see, that they're not doing what they expected to be able to do. So therefore, he's pulling back into Donbass, and a lot of stuff's happening with Mariupol at the moment, which is really a linchpin between the Russian-controlled areas and the rest of Ukraine. But the Western reaction to Putin so far has been predominantly sanctions, and yet those don't seem to have worked in any way, shape, or form. It seems that Putin, in his non-planned plan, as it were, he was prepared for sanctions and has sanction-proofed Russia. How long can that realistically carry on for before the isolationism really upsets the governing body in Russia?
Well, I think the problem is with the concept of sanctions. I mean, sanctions are not particularly a near-term strategy. I mean, you put on economic sanctions and they don't actually start to have an effect for quite some time. And you're only now, I mean, after 3 months of sanctions, kind of rolling sanctions, I might add, which are never very effective, because by the time you come to the next level of sanctions, they've already accommodated to the first level. And I mean, I thought we learned this in Vietnam, but apparently not. Sanctions are long-term approaches, and we haven't had a long-term yet. especially when you consider that, again, Russia thought this was going to be 3, possibly 4 days, and they'd have all of the major cities capitulating to what they wanted.
I want to talk briefly about the recent news that the EU is moving to forego Russian oil. Now, this could be a real game changer in terms of Russia being able to finance its war on the ground in Ukraine. But I think a lot of people are missing that with the EU, you'd have to have all 27 member states sign up for that. But we're not seeing complete support from all these European Union members, are we?
No, and the reason is that 43% of all of their natural gas comes from Russia, and that's a chunk of gas, as they say in Tennessee. Again, if they wanted to do this, they should have done this a year ago, and we probably wouldn't be here. But as you know, we can always look back and see all of our mistakes.
Yeah, hindsight is very much 2020. One final question for you, Dave. What we know about the Biden administration so far in terms of dealing with aggression overseas, the only real track record we have is the Afghanistan withdrawal. Now, that was, but by all metrics, that was just a disaster, a terrible disaster. Do you think people have faith that the administration has learned any lessons from its strategy in Afghanistan and is applying those lessons to Ukraine right now?
Absolutely not. I mean, this administration, the Biden administration, has a fundamentally flawed approach to foreign policy. Their approach is, if we're nice to them, they'll be nice to us. Now, there's nothing more absurd in foreign policy than that approach. And you're going to see this again. And here's a Dave prediction. You're going to see this again in North Korea. They're still holding to the idea that they can negotiate with Kim Jong-un. You can't. I mean, you have to put real pressure first on these dictators and the people who would do their neighbors harm before you kind of give them the carrot. If you ever do give them the carrot. This obviously is a problem with the Russians.
Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much.
You bet. Happy to be with you, Mark.
After this short break, we talk preferred pronouns and defending the First Amendment. Don't touch that dial. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
It's all hubbub in the legal and constitutional world this week. From mask mandates to compelled speech cases, we've seen it all. But to dig into the depths of how this impacts you and your liberty, we're joined by constitutional attorney and host of the excellent Uprising podcast, also Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire. All those roles rolled into one. Welcome back, Scott.
Thank you, Mark. Pleasure to be here. He, him.
Him. Are you clearing your throat? I'm not sure here. Okay, so let's start with the issue that I know everybody wants to discuss, and it's the state of free speech in America. Now, we've seen a lot of debate about this and how it should be regulated with the news of Elon Musk and his plans to take over Twitter. But there was a recent case out of Shawnee University. Can you give us the broad strokes on that?
Mark, free speech in the United States rests in one place, and that is with the people. If they demand free speech, they'll get it. And if they are tolerant of censors or demand censorship themselves, then that's what they'll get. And I think that what we see now with the reaction to Elon Musk and Twitter does not give a charitable account for how most Americans feel about free speech, or at least many Americans. Maybe I don't want to go too far and too cynical, but it hasn't been encouraging. So in any case, Nick Merriweather is a professor at Shawnee State University in Ohio, and he sued that university in 2018 because they basically disciplined him for refusing to use one of his students' preferred pronouns. This student, whose preferred pronouns deviated from their observed biological sex, demanded that he call that Professor Merriweather call them by their preferred name pronouns, and he said, "No, I'll call you by any name that you want, but I will not go ahead with your preferences with pronouns." Well, that student said right at the time that they were going to try to get him fired. They weren't successful in getting him fired, but they were successful in getting an investigation and disciplinary letter and some other negatives, which is not permissible if, in fact, it was free speech. And that's what Professor Merriweather argued in his lawsuit. And he got a $400,000 check from the university, along with his legal fees paid when that case came back finally and recently.
Now, it's funny that this case has come up, and it seems so new, because isn't this exactly the issue that Professor Jordan B. Peterson first came to prominence for, where under the Canada's new law was that he would have to use the preferred pronouns of people, and he refused to succumb to what he called, and what I believe is the technical definition of it, coerced or forced speech.
Yeah, so compelled speech is how I usually phrase it, and that's my understanding of exactly what Peterson was on about. He the whole sort of spark that ignited his international fame is really that video where he says, I it's not about whether I choose to say these things. It's just that I refuse to be compelled to say them. And so, yes, the difference, of course, is that Justin Peterson was a Canadian professor in a Canadian college. I'm not familiar with Canadian laws like I am with American laws. So that's about as deep as I can go with the legality of Peterson's situation.
So let's get back to the Shawnee University one here. With this ruling, with this win for the professor, does it set a precedent, or does it encourage direction for other institutions in terms of attempting to coerce faculty members to use preferred pronouns or any other type of speech, for that matter, against their beliefs?
Well, it doesn't really set a precedent, except that no. So I want to be careful about using that word legalistically. Okay, what it does do is it announces to all of the colleges and universities in America that they better be careful about how they treat their faculty members who deviate from whatever the administration's preferred course of conduct is here, because they may have to pay up significant money damages if they do so. We saw, I think it was last week, came down, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, that the Oberlin College lawsuit against them for basically manufacturing racial hatred towards this one family that owned a store in the college town. They had to pay, or were ordered to pay, I think it was $32-ish million, depending on how it's counted. And the more these kinds of, we've just really seen the wave of these lawsuits come in now to where these awards are being upheld, which is what happened in the case of Professor Merriweather and with Oberlin. So I think it's just like, okay, we have the initial instances that generate these cases, and then now we have the result. And when the results come in, and there are many results that are piling up, and by and large against universities, well, that's when the sort of board of trustee meetings come in, and they say, hey, maybe it'd be good to keep some of our money in our pocket and not violate these people's rights.
So we're seeing that in the academic world. What about in the private business world?
Well, in the private world, you can punish people for their speech. If you work at a company and you don't like the way somebody talks, you're free to fire them if you like. So,
well, yeah,
no problem.
The term "it's a private company, it can do what it wants" that used to be so popular before Elon Musk said that he was willing to buy Twitter,
right,
and has now reverted to almost crickets. That's not a term that's used very much anymore. So let's talk briefly.
It's so horrible how he wants to increase freedom of speech on Twitter. So,
well, let's delve into that a little bit. You see, we've had a lot of people in the media,
it's shameful, Mark. It really
journalists
is
saying that we need more regulation of speech on the internet. We need more censorship on the internet, although they don't use the term censorship. What's your take?
My take is that that's a national scandal from every journalist, really every public personality whose work depends on the dissemination of ideas. It's scandalous for, but especially for journalists, that they should want more censorship. It just tells you how far down the rabbit hole we've gone with people not respecting freedom of speech and not understanding that their freedom of speech depends on your freedom of speech and my freedom of speech. And it's going to be it's one of those things where I don't want them to have to learn their lesson the hard way. That would be awful as well. It's so we have to do the best we can to convince these misguided souls that freedom depends not on censorship, but on freedom.
I think it would be an interesting experiment to see if schools across the nation were to be as keen to teach what the First Amendment is as they are to teach.
Right. Yes. This biological, whatever, differences between boys and girls that seem too advanced for grade level, that kind of thing. Is that where you were going?
That is exactly where I was going. It's funny how the priorities seem so mismatched.
Well, we have this doxing of the Libs of TikTok account, and that seems to be right on point with what you're saying. I mean, this account does nothing but repost the fantastic and often scandalous public videos that often liberal teachers post about exposing their young school students to aspects of their gender identity and sexuality, which seemingly have no place in school, whether we're talking about a kind of conservative or heteronormative culture or some wildly progressive one. It's not the business of a second grader in any case.
Yeah, I think it's notable that Libs of TikTok isn't passing comment or judgment on the videos. They're using publicly available videos that these teachers, these educators have put out onto the internet themselves. And I think the argument that we live in echo chambers, I think Libs of TikTok, they were pretty much breaking down those walls of echo chambers and exposing people from one side of the political spectrum to people on the other side of the political spectrum. And shouldn't that be applauded?
Mark, I saw, well, yes, and I saw, I think it was a tweet from Sagar and Jetty from the Breaking Points program, and he, I thought, made a very good point, which was, the real story here is how this non-political actor person just created this massive account, which is one of the most important accounts for conservatism and liberals on Twitter and in the political discourse. Maybe has moved this whole Florida legislation about don't say gay and all this. That's, in large part credited to that account from Sagar, like how that happened politically. That's a fascinating story, and it is just that they can't even abide their own content, right? When the light's shown on it.
There's nothing more devastating than a mirror, Scott. Thanks ever so much for joining us.
Gee, thanks, Mark.
That's almost it for this week on Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I want to thank our guests, Lisa K. Donner, Jeff Charles, Dave Patterson, and Scott Cosenza. And of course you, the faithful listeners, for taking the time to join us. You're always appreciated. My parting shot for this week. It seems that we have become distracted politically. Rather than focusing on the fundamentals of what makes a nation exceptional, we're caught up in the weeds of preferred pronouns, gender education, legacy media talking points, all distractions from what those who want to preserve a nation need to be looking at. How to strengthen the Constitution and apply its principles to the modern political sphere. As President Abraham Lincoln once said, "Don't interfere with anything in the Constitution. That must be maintained, for it is the only safeguard of our liberties." And there can be no more noble goal nor aspiration than preserving the very things that make us free. Perhaps the time has come to refocus on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights as the guiding documents they were always meant to be. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.
I think we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fight for freedom.
The tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I
others.
can do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it. Rock on. I'm gone.